Prometheus, clever forethinker, you knew your fate. As you scaled the jagged cliffs of Olympus, in your mind's eye you foresaw the beak and talon of Zeus's eagle glinting in the sun. You foresaw the jagged cliff, the Hephaestus forged chains, your own blood running down your bronzed thighs. You knew the unending suffering which the hand of fate prepared for you, yet you would endure it all, willingly, for the sake of mankind, for the sake of your highest creation. In the first video in this series, we discussed how the death of God and the apparent collapse of Western civilization has cleared the way for the creation of a higher type of human being, Nietzsche's Overman, which he describes as a free spirit and a barbarian from the heights, a union of spiritual superiority with well-being and an excess of strength. In the following videos, we discussed three major events which have shaped our species. Firstly, our acquisition of higher consciousness and departure from the animal state of being, as depicted in the biblical story of the fall. Secondly, the conquest of the agricultural way of living over the nomadic lifestyle, as symbolized by the story of Cain and Abel. And thirdly, the creation of civilization and high culture, shown in the myth of Prometheus. We have talked about how each of these events prepared the way for the creation of the Overman, but Prometheus is the first type, or in Jungian terms, archetype, of the Overman which we have encountered. Prometheus possesses three vital characteristics of the Overman, as Nietzsche conceptualized him: Amor Fati, or love of one's fate, an excess of strength and power, and the willingness to sacrifice himself in the creation of something higher. Prometheus knew that Zeus would condemn him to a fate of eternal torment for the crime of stealing fire, yet despite this foreknowledge, he chose to lift humanity out of the mud by giving them the gift of fire and civilization. By accepting his fate and even charging towards it, Prometheus affirms life. To see life as a divine tragedy ordained by fate, each moment foretold, each decision already made, is an idea which is completely foreign to the modern man. He wanders a cold, meaningless universe where all is chance and circumstance. He is but a brief light in a dark universe, and what awaits him is the endless, silent night of death. Slowly, the rot of nihilism strangles his soul. He becomes pale and ashen, a shade wandering the earth, as day by day he gives in to despair. But the man of overflowing health and vitality believes in fate and destiny. To him, modernity is no accidental aberration of history. To him, modernity is a challenge, and in taking up this challenge with Promethean will, he finds his supreme meaning. The man of health knows that the whole history of life has led to him and to his moment of struggle and triumph. In his body, he knows that his spirit was destined for this age, for this life, for this very moment. He says yes to life, and in aspiring to the heights, he affirms life. Only a sick animal, weak of will and beaten down by the spirit of gravity, sees life as suffering. This is the attitude of the spiritually stunted and the overly intellectual who seek to escape into the Platonic realm. They long for the green meadow of nirvana, heaven, virtual reality, or some other utopia in which they can finally rest, free of suffering. But the healthy animal, who has an excess of strength, energy, and will, sees life as a challenge, as overcoming, as striving, as constant transformation. He knows that each triumph requires a long climb, that beneath every beautiful surface there are terrible depths, that each act of creation is also an act of destruction. Nietzsche believed that the god Dionysus exemplified the creative frenzy and overflow of power which was necessary for the creation of the higher man. In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche writes, "Only in the Dionysian mysteries, in the psychology of the Dionysian condition, does the fundamental fact of the Hellenic instinct express itself, its will to life. What did the Hellenes procure in these mysteries? Eternal life, the eternal recurrence of life, the future promised and made sacred in the past, the triumphant yes to life, beyond death and change, true life as collective survival through reproduction, through the mysteries of sexuality." Thus, for the Greeks, the sexual symbol was the ultimate revered symbol, the authentic, deep meaning in all ancient piety. Every element of the act of reproduction, of pregnancy and birth, awoke the highest and most festive feelings. In the teachings of the mysteries, pain is declared holy. The pangs of the childbearer make pain in general holy. All becoming and growth, everything that vouches for the future, requires pain. For there to be the eternal joy of creation, for the will to life to affirm itself eternally, there must also eternally be the torment of the childbearer. All this is signified by the name Dionysus. I know no higher symbolism than this Greek symbolism, the symbolism of the Dionysian rites. In them, the deepest instinct of life, the instinct for the future of life, for the eternity of life, is expressed religiously. The very way to life, reproduction as the holy way. Nietzsche saw in Dionysus life in its highest form, life in abundance, excess, and frenzy, life exalting itself and its own creation. For the Greeks, sexuality represented the divine act of creation. However, for insects and many lower forms of life, reproduction serves simply as a means of rapid, mass replication. It is only in ascendant life forms which strive for differentiation and the production of greater and greater specimens, that sexuality becomes holy. Nietzsche continues, "The psychology of the orgiastic as an overflowing feeling of life and energy, where even pain works as a stimulant, gave me the key to the concept of the tragic, saying yes to life, even in its most strange and intractable problems, the will to life, celebrating its own inexhaustibility by sacrificing its highest types. That is what I called Dionysian. That is what I found as the bridge to the psychology of the tragic poet, not in order to be released from terror and pity, not in order to purify oneself of a dangerous emotion through its vehement discharge, but instead, beyond terror and pity, in order to be oneself, the eternal joy of becoming, that joy that also includes in itself the joy of destruction. To carve the Overman from the raw material of man, the stone must endure the wrath of the hammer and chisel. The stone must undergo 1,000 pressures and pains. Creation necessitates suffering. In nature, species are only improved through pressure. When this pressure is removed in civilization, many become soft and purposeless. Without the struggle for survival, their life lacks all meaning. They poison themselves with sterile pleasures, which are absent any creative purpose. But for others, the removal of this pressure and the alleviation of the struggle for mere survival provides them the opportunity to thrive and to gather to themselves an overflow of health and vitality. This is where Apollonian idealism becomes a necessity. We need the raw strength and power of the instincts to energize us, but we also need the idealistic vision of the artist to drive us and put pressure upon us. Prometheus is the perfect union of the Dionysian and the Apollonian. He has the overflowing health and strength of Dionysus, which allows him to affirm his fate and suffering, and yet he also possesses the idealism and artistic vision of Apollo, which drives him to defy it. Prometheus represents life's striving for ever higher, more beautiful and powerful forms against the spirit of gravity and the homogenized life of the herd. Prometheus is both creator and sacrifice, and thus an embodiment of the dualistic nature of creation. In this way, he is also a precursor to Christ. Prometheus sacrifices himself in service of his vision for mankind, and his suffering is justified in his creation. Every one of his actions and the whole of his fate reaches its pinnacle in man. In the Gay Science, Nietzsche writes, "Perhaps to a distant age, the whole of religion will appear as an exercise and prelude. Perhaps religion could have been the strange means of making it possible one day for a few individuals to enjoy the whole self-sufficiency of a god and all his power of self-redemption. Indeed, one may ask, did Prometheus first have to imagine having stolen light and pay for it before he could finally discover that he had created light by desiring light, and that not only man but also God was the work of his own hands and the clay in his hands?" The higher type recognizes himself as a prelude to the Overman. Thus, his whole life becomes an act of creation. He does not restrain his creative will, and does not hesitate to promise more than could ever be fulfilled. He is overflowing with an excess of life, strength, and health. He laughs at the spirit of gravity when it creeps upon him in the night and chastises him for his arrogance. "Could an amoeba imagine man?" he says. "Could an amoeba desire man? Yet I can imagine the Overman. My heart desires the Overman. And in imagining him and desiring him, I create him. This is my will."
Oh, oh, oh.